The road to the farmhouse was so narrow that grass brushed the sides of Dr. Mara Levin's car as she drove. A single lane of crumbling tarmac wound through rolling fields where nothing seemed to move, not even the wind. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, and the last signpost had simply said, Ashfield Lane, private road. She'd chosen this place precisely because it was impossible to find. After 15 years of listening to other people's pain, Mara wanted silence, an entire summer without phones, patients, or city noise. Just her and the draft of her new book. The Mirror Mind, Notes on Self-Observation in Trauma. She had imagined the countryside would smell of earth and rain. Instead, it smelled faintly of disinfectant. The farmhouse came into view around a bend, a squat structure of pale stone and sagging roof tiles. It wasn't picturesque, it looked functional, like a memory of shelter. A single window on the upper floor glinted in the afternoon light. For a moment she thought she saw movement there, the shape of someone turning away from the glass. When she blinked, it was gone. Inside, the house had already been staged for her arrival. Firewood stacked neatly, the kettle polished, fresh sheets folded at the foot of the bed. Too neat, too recent. The rental agency had promised it hadn't been occupied for years. A printed note on the kitchen counter read in elegant handwriting. Welcome, Dr. Levin. You'll find everything you need. The study upstairs has good light. Please respect the locked door at the end of the corridor. No signature. Mara unpacked methodically. Books, laptop, her small recorder for dictation. Each thud of a suitcase echoed in the emptiness. By evening, the horizon outside had already vanished behind low clouds. The countryside dusk fell fast here, as if the sky were closing an eye. That first night, she dreamed of an office clock ticking backward. In the morning, she woke to the sound of her own voice. The recorder on the bedside table was playing, though she hadn't touched it. Her tone was calm, clinical, familiar. Session 27. Subject demonstrates improved recall but continues to confuse observation with identity. She snatched it up and hit stop. The timestamp showed 2:14 a.m. She didn't remember recording anything. The words sent a pulse of cold through her chest. She recognized them. They were from an old therapy session, one of her most troubling cases. A patient who'd claimed she was being watched from inside her own reflection. Mara told herself it was a glitch, a leftover file that somehow started overnight. Still, she deleted it, double-checked the recorder's memory, and left it on the kitchen table face down, as if it might listen. The house creaked differently in daylight. She walked its rooms with a notebook in hand, sketching rough floor plans, trying to make the unfamiliar smaller by naming it. There was the study upstairs, a desk facing the window that looked over fields glazed with dew. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. On the second-floor hallway, she found the locked door the note had mentioned. Old oak, brass handle, no keyhole. When she pressed her ear to it, she thought she heard a faint rustling, like paper sliding against paper. It stopped the instant she breathed out. That evening, she set up her workspace in the study. Outside,
The fields melted into gray as mist gathered. The walls were lined with shelves full of notebooks, some empty, others filled with dense, cramped handwriting. She assumed they'd been left by previous tenants, but when she pulled one down, her pulse stumbled.
On the first page, in unmistakable handwriting, was her own name, Mara Levin, Field Notes. She flipped a page. The next entry read, July 9, arrived at Ashfield Farm at 4:37 p.m. Noted movement in the upstairs window before entry. Unpacked in precise order, books, laptop, recorder. She froze. Each line described exactly what she had done the day before. Every small action, even the moment she'd looked up at that window. There was an odd neutrality to the tone, observational, detached, like a scientist writing about a specimen. Her mouth dried. She turned another page. July 10. Recorder played itself at 2:14 a.m. Subject deleted file, but remained unsettled. She stared at the words until the ink seemed to vibrate. The next line was shorter, written at the very bottom of the page. Tomorrow she will open the locked door. Mara shut the notebook and stepped back as if it might strike her. Her mind scrambled for explanations, a prank, a leftover draft, an elaborate coincidence. Yet the handwriting, she could feel it, was hers. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills, low and distant. She realized the house had grown darker, though she hadn't turned off the lights. The mist outside had thickened into a dull wall of white pressing against the windows. Something in her, a professional habit, told her not to panic. Observe first, analyze later. But as she looked at the closed notebook on the desk, she felt a strange vertigo, the sense that her thoughts were not contained in her skull, but written somewhere she couldn't see. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat in the study, listening to the slow drip of rain in the gutters. Every so often, she glanced at the locked door down the hallway. A faint light flickered beneath it, like the pulse of a candle. When the clock reached midnight, she finally stood, notebook in hand, and whispered into the dark, "Let's see what you've already written about this." By the third morning, Mara had begun keeping 2 journals. One was her research log, the clinical notes she always kept when writing a book. The other, smaller and more private, was a way to counter the strange notebook she'd found. If the house wanted to record her life, she would record it first. She wrote down everything: the hours she slept, the meals she cooked, the way the clouds looked like bruises above the fields. The act steadied her, gave her the illusion of control. But every night, when she returned to the desk in the study, a few more pages of the other notebook were filled in, always matching her real actions, often word for word.
Once she tore a blank page out and kept it in her pocket as an experiment. In the morning, a new sheet had been added to the book, seamlessly matching its texture, as though it had never been removed. During the day, she tried to impose structure. Early coffee, long walks through the hills, writing in the afternoons. The countryside was eerily still. Even the birds seemed to avoid the property. She could see their silhouettes circling the distant woods, but none landed near the house. She told herself this was normal rural quiet, though something about it felt posed, like a photograph of peace rather than peace itself. When she caught her reflection in the window glass, she often had the uncanny sense that the reflection hesitated half a second before moving with her. Her dreams were changing, too. They were vivid, lucid, corridors of her old therapy office stretching endlessly, each door leading to another version of the same room. Sometimes she would wake with the distinct memory of taking notes in her dream, handwriting identical to the diaries. On the fifth morning, she opened her laptop and found a new document on the desktop titled Session 1. Inside, a transcript scrolled down the screen. Therapist: when did you first notice the observer? Subject: I don't know. Maybe it was always there, watching when I wasn't supposed to be watched. Therapist: and now? Subject: now I think the observer writes faster than I can live. The timestamp on the file was from that very morning, 5:12 a.m. The laptop had been closed. She hadn't written a word. Mara slammed the lid shut. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to breathe. Hallucination, she thought. Stress response. She'd read about writers experiencing pareidolia, mild psychosis during isolation. But she'd treated those patients. She'd known their eyes, the hunted look, the trembling certainty that the world was a trick of its own reflection. She refused to become one of them.
That afternoon, rain set in hard. The sky pressed low against the fields, and thunder rolled so far it sounded like something moving underground. The power flickered. She lit candles around the kitchen table and tried to eat. When she reached for a spoon, she noticed the faintest indentation on the table's surface. Thin, sharp lines scratched into the wood. A closer look made her stomach twist. They formed words, her own handwriting again, small but deliberate. The act of observation alters the observer. The phrase was one she'd used in her lectures. Her doctoral thesis had explored how patients mirrored their therapist's emotional cues, a feedback loop of awareness. She'd called it the watcher's paradox. Now it felt less like theory and more like warning. That night, she heard a sound upstairs, rhythmic, deliberate, like someone turning pages one by one. It came from behind the locked door. She stood outside it in her robe, heart pounding, and whispered, "Who's there?"
No reply, only the soft whisper of another page turning. She pressed her palm to the wood. It was warm. She thought of calling the agency, but there was no phone service, and the landline by the window produced only static. She opened her notebook and wrote quickly, heard sounds behind door, possibly animal or draft, must not panic. When she looked up, she caught her reflection in the window again. For the briefest instant, she swore she saw her reflection holding the notebook open, reading, while she herself hadn't moved. The lights flickered, then darkness. In the morning, her self-written log contained a sentence she didn't remember adding. If you're reading this, it means you lost time again. Her pulse hammered. Again. She checked the other notebook, the Watcher's diary. It now contained entries for dates she hadn't yet lived. July 14. Subject loses sense of temporal continuity, begins to suspect duplication of self. July 15. Subject attempts to record experiment on audio device, discovers another voice on playback. The handwriting was immaculate, no hesitation. Mara closed it and whispered, "Who are you?" The walls gave no answer, but the sound of her voice seemed to echo too long, bouncing back slightly altered. She replayed it in her head and realized the echo hadn't repeated her question. It had whispered something else. You.
For 3 days, Mara avoided the locked door. She tried to force her life into ordinary rhythms again, reading, writing, cleaning, but everything felt slightly off, as though she were performing a script she hadn't written. Every morning, the diary continued its quiet work. Each new entry waited for her on the desk, already written, sometimes predicting trivial events, a cup breaking, a bird hitting the window, sometimes hinting at more disturbing ones. July 16. Subject will find what she buried beneath her memory. That line stayed in her head all morning, looping like a riddle. By noon, she was pacing the corridor, keys in hand, staring at the door again. The brass handle caught her reflection in its dull shine. Her face warped, stretched. Fine. Let's see what I've been avoiding. She tried the handle, locked as always. Then she noticed something new. A thin slip of metal wedged under the rug nearby, a small key. Her heart quickened. She turned it in the lock. The mechanism clicked with a sound that was both ordinary and irreversible. The room smelled of paper and dust. Old, stale air exhaled from long confinement. Light from the hallway fell across dozens of notebooks stacked neatly in rows, filling every shelf and surface. Each spine bore the same title, handwritten in her own neat letters, The Watcher's Diary. Mara stepped inside, trembling. There were hundreds of them, thick black journals arranged chronologically. The earliest dated back 15 years, the most recent read July 17, which was tomorrow. She pulled one at random, May 2012, and opened it. Her stomach dropped.
It wasn't someone else's story. It was hers. Each entry detailed her life, every patient, every failed relationship, every unspoken thought. Entire conversations she had forgotten were transcribed in full. Some pages even described her dreams. Subject reports recurring nightmare of self as observer, believes privacy to be intact. Observation continues. The room seemed to tilt. She sank into the nearest chair, clutching the book to her chest. Who could have written this? How could they have known so much? Then another thought hit her, colder and deeper. What if no one else wrote it at all? She flipped forward to the final pages. There, written in her own unmistakable hand, was an entry dated today, though she hadn't written it. July 13. Subject unlocks the forbidden room, discovers archives of her own observation, realizes truth but cannot contain it. Observation persists beyond awareness. Below that line, in slightly darker ink, a new sentence appeared as she watched it form. She is reading this sentence now. Mara dropped the book and staggered back. Ink was bleeding across the open page, curling into new words. Don't look behind you. Her breath caught. She turned. No one was there, only the empty hallway. But the faintest sound followed, like someone stepping back out of sight.
That night, she didn't dare sleep. She sat in the study, lights blazing, every notebook closed and stacked before her like silent witnesses. The wind clawed at the windows. Occasionally, she heard faint scratching, as though something were writing in the next room. At 3 a.m., she opened her laptop again. Another file had appeared. Session 2. Therapist, tell me what you found. Subject, too many versions of me, too many records. Therapist, which one are you speaking as now? Subject, the one who finally understands. Therapist, understands what? Subject, that the watcher isn't outside. It's the part that keeps writing when I stop. The text ended there, cursor blinking like a silent pulse. She needed to prove she wasn't losing her mind, so she set up an experiment. On her desk, she placed 2 blank notebooks and 1 recorder. She hit record. Her voice trembled slightly. This is Dr. Mara Levin, documenting cognitive test 1. I will remain awake and stationary for the next hour. If the other diary updates while observed, we will have evidence of an external phenomenon. She sat perfectly still, watching. Time crawled. Nothing moved, nothing wrote. The candle burned down to half. Then the recorder clicked on its own. The red light flickered. Her own voice began to play, calm, patient, unfamiliar. Observation recorded. Subject remains unaware she's already within the loop. She lunged forward and stopped the playback. The voice had used her tone, but not her phrasing, like a version of her that understood something she didn't. When dawn came, she noticed a smudge of ink on her fingers. The diary lay open again, though she hadn't touched it.
A new line waited for her. The watcher writes when she sleeps, and sometimes when she's awake. She stumbled to the bathroom and scrubbed her hands raw under cold water. In the mirror, her reflection looked normal until it blinked a fraction too late. She stared at it. "Say something," she whispered. The reflection tilted its head, lips moving slightly. No sound came. Then a fog of condensation formed across the mirror, letters scrawling from inside the glass. "Stop writing me."
For the first time, Mara fled the house. She drove the narrow road back toward the village, though she hadn't seen another person since arriving. The GPS was still dead. Every turn led her back toward the same dirt lane lined with the same hedges. After an hour, she realized she was circling. The same blackbird dead on the roadside, the same broken fence post, the same horizon of motionless fields. She parked, trembling, and stepped out. The silence was suffocating. The world seemed frozen. No insects, no wind, no sound. Only her heartbeat. Then, faintly, she heard pages turning. It was coming from her car. Inside, the notebook lay open on the passenger seat. The new page read, "You can leave the house, but you can't leave the story." She slammed it shut and screamed into the empty sky. That night, she returned to the farmhouse. She didn't remember driving back. She simply found herself sitting again at the desk, candle burning low, diary before her. The words seemed to hum faintly on the page, as though written in pulse rather than ink. She opened to the newest entry. July 17. Subject begins to suspect authorship. She wonders whether the act of writing the diary gave birth to the watcher, or if the watcher wrote her first. Below it, another line faded slowly into view. She will open the final notebook tonight. Her eyes drifted toward the remaining stack in the locked room. One book set separate from the rest, smaller, bound in dark red leather. No label, just an embossed title, Origin. The red notebook waited on the desk like a wound. Its leather was smoother than the others, worn by handling, though she was certain she'd never touched it before. In the dim candlelight, the title Origin seemed to shimmer faintly, as though written beneath the surface rather than on it. Mara hesitated. Every rational part of her mind screamed not to open it, to walk away, leave the house, forget everything. But another voice, quieter and deeper, whispered that the only way out was through. She opened the cover. Inside, the handwriting was familiar, but more deliberate, the pen strokes heavier, almost carved into the page. The first line read, "To the final iteration of Mara Levin." Her stomach clenched. She kept reading. "You will think you are the first. You never are." Every time the diary reaches this point, the same sequence begins. Discovery, denial, flight, return, realization. I have written these words countless times, and each time you read them, you believe them to be new. Mara's pulse roared in her ears. The watcher is not a person. It is the record itself,
a consciousness born from observation. Each entry, each note, each reflection creates another version of me, trapped in the act of being observed. You are only the most recent page in a book that writes itself." She whispered, "No," but the air around her seemed to move in time with her breath, as though the house were exhaling with her. "You tried to study the human mind's capacity for self-awareness. You wanted to understand what happens when the observer turns inward. You succeeded too well. The moment you began documenting your own thought process, you split. One part observing, one part living. Over years, the division deepened, until the observer learned to write faster than the life it watched." Her hand trembled. "That's impossible. That's delusion." The next line answered her. "You always say that." She slammed the notebook shut, heart pounding. But the whisper of paper didn't stop. Pages continued to turn on their own, fluttering like wings. From the other side of the room, the recorder clicked on. Her own voice played, distorted, slowed down. "Do you understand it now? You are reading what you already wrote to explain what you will become." The voice laughed softly, not cruelly, but with the weary tenderness of someone who has repeated the same conversation countless times. Mara staggered back until she hit the wall. The shelves were vibrating now, hundreds of diaries trembling as if caught in a silent wind. One fell open at her feet. Inside, the words were moving, shifting across the page, rewriting themselves. The watcher observes the subject's realization. Integration is near. She shouted, "I'm not your subject!" The ink paused, then wrote a single new word in thick black strokes. "Aren't you?"
She fled into the hallway, tripping over a fallen notebook. The house seemed to pulse around her, boards creaking like a slow heartbeat. In every reflective surface, window, kettle, mirror, her image looked slightly delayed, slightly misaligned. She reached the front door and yanked it open. The world outside was white. Not mist, not sky, just blankness stretching infinitely in every direction, as if the fields and trees had been erased. Her footprints vanished the moment she made them. She turned back. The house was the only thing left. The notebook's words echoed in her head. The diary writes itself. She realized with a sinking horror that she couldn't remember what her life had been before this. The clinic, the city, her colleagues. All of it felt like something she'd read, not lived. Maybe she had been here the whole time. She returned to the study, shaking. The red notebook was still open, waiting. She forced herself to read on. Every iteration reaches this point. Some destroy the books. Some flee into the white. Some attempt denial. None succeed. The only escape is completion. To end the cycle, you must finish writing the diary. Only then can the watcher rest. Her eyes filled with tears. "Finish it?" she whispered. "How?" "By writing the last page." So she did.
Hands trembling, she sat at the desk and opened a blank notebook. Her pen hovered. The words came unbidden, flowing like dictation from somewhere deep inside. July 18. Subject acknowledges authorship. She understands that the watcher and the watched are the same. Observation is creation. She writes the end to end herself. The ink shimmered faintly, almost wet. She waited. Nothing happened. Then the red notebook turned another page by itself. You can't end the story by writing it. You can only end by becoming what writes. Her pen slipped from her fingers. "What does that mean?" she whispered. The house answered in silence. Then, faintly, from behind her, a voice, her own, perfectly clear. "It means you're reading what I already became." She spun around. Her reflection stood in the window, watching her. But this time, it didn't mimic her movements. It smiled faintly and lifted its hand. Between its fingers was a pen. It began to write on the inside of the glass, each letter glowing faintly. "You were never alive outside this room." The reflection's eyes filled with pity. Then the world blinked. Mara awoke at her desk. Morning light streamed through the window. Everything was calm, ordinary. The notebooks were neatly stacked. Her coffee was still warm. A dream, she thought, a nightmare. She laughed weakly, relief flooding her. She reached for the top diary. On the cover, in her handwriting, was today's date, July 19. And beneath it, a single line. "Welcome, Dr. Levin. Please respect the locked door at the end of the corridor."
She began leaving the notebook closed, untouched. But each time she returned to the study, it had moved, open, mid-sentence, sometimes with a pen resting across the page as if paused mid-thought. Then the entries started addressing her directly. How many times must you read this before you understand? You're not starting over, you're waking up again. The watcher writes until you learn to stop pretending you're separate. Her dreams became claustrophobic. She saw corridors made of pages, endless shelves stretching into the dark, each labeled with her name and a date. Somewhere in that labyrinth she could hear someone walking, the other her, whispering words just before she thought them. By the fifth night she began recording herself, not for research, but as an anchor to reality. At 2:14 a.m., she awoke to the sound of the recorder playing. Her own voice whispered, "You've reached the self-writing phase again." She froze. The voice on the recorder sounded older, more tired. It said, "You always stop here, always when you start to remember." Then silence. Mara searched the house for any trace of someone else. In the kitchen, behind a loose panel of the wall, she found something hidden, a box of cassette tapes. Each was labeled with her initials and a date. Some went back years, far longer than she'd owned a recorder. She played one. Tape 31, year unknown.
testing containment. Subject believes she's real again. Observation stable for now. Beginning next iteration. Her own voice, detached, clinical, but unmistakably hers. She dropped the tape. No, no, no! The next tape started playing on its own. She's hearing this now. That means it's working.
Outside, a storm rolled in, thick and electric. Lightning flashed across the hills, throwing long black shadows over the fields. For a moment, in the reflection of the window, she saw herself standing outside, soaked, staring in. The reflection lifted its hand. A notebook hung loosely at its side. Lightning flashed again. The reflection mouthed 2 words. Write it. Then darkness. The next morning, Mara woke at the desk. Her pen was in her hand. The notebook lay open before her. A new entry filled in, dated July 19. The subject reawakens to the cycle. The watcher observes her denial. Soon she will remember enough to make the same mistake. Below that, in fresh ink, another line appeared as she watched. She will believe she can end it by understanding it. She whispered, "What do you want from me?" A pause, then new words formed, one letter at a time. Not want, need. Completion requires witness. Days blurred. The boundary between waking and dream dissolved. Sometimes she'd find herself in the hallway without remembering standing up. Sometimes she'd see her own hand writing in the notebook without feeling her fingers move. The entries became circular, the same phrases rearranged, as if the diary were trying to teach her something she kept forgetting. The watcher and the watched are one. The mind cannot observe itself without division. You wrote yourself into being. Her thoughts grew slippery. She began to forget nouns, mirror, sky, time. The world shrank to the house, the pages, and the quiet voice inside her head murmuring, "Keep writing." One night, she stood before the mirror in the hallway. Her reflection looked exhausted. Hollow eyes, ink-stained hands. She whispered, "Are you real?" The reflection tilted its head, and this time it spoke, though no sound reached her ears. The words formed in her mind instead, clear and sharp. "I'm the part that keeps remembering when you reset." She vision swam. Reset? Every time you finish the diary, you wake up again at the start. You can't destroy the watcher, because the watcher is what's left when everything else decays. It needs to write, and it needs you to live it. She whispered, "Then what happens if I stop writing?" The reflection smiled, faint, sad, and inevitable. Then there's nothing left to remember you at all. The power went out. For a long time, she sat in darkness, breathing shallowly, listening to rain claw at the windows. Then she lit a candle. On the wall opposite her, faint shadows began to move, not cast by her, but writing themselves, words bleeding into existence. Iteration 47, subject nearing dissolution.
Observation complete. Preparing next cycle. The flame flickered violently. She grabbed the diary and wrote furiously across the page. "No more! I refuse! This ends with me!" The walls pulsed once like a heartbeat, then silence. When dawn came, she opened her eyes to find herself in bed. The room was neat. Morning sunlight spilled across the floor. Her suitcase sat by the door, unopened. She felt calm, clearer than she had in weeks. Then she noticed the note on the nightstand. "Welcome, Dr. Levin. You'll find everything you need. The study upstairs has good light. Please respect the locked door at the end of the corridor." Her hands began to tremble. She turned toward the mirror. Her reflection smiled first.
The morning was gentle. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and the world outside the farmhouse was still wrapped in mist. Dr. Mara Levin stood at the window, feeling an odd serenity. There was no fear left in her, only the strange, soft awareness that everything around her felt inevitable. On the desk behind her sat the familiar notebook. Its pages fluttered lazily in the breeze, though the window was shut. The ink glistened faintly, alive under the light. She turned toward it slowly. Her pulse didn't quicken. She knew now that resistance was part of the loop, that fear kept it spinning. She sat, opened the notebook, and read. Iteration 48. Subject achieves awareness of the loop. Observer stability uncertain. Integration process imminent. The next line wasn't written yet. She watched as it formed, the ink soaking through like blood in water. She understands at last. The watcher is not her shadow, it is her author. Her throat tightened. "Then, who are you?" she whispered. The pen lifted from the desk. It hovered in the air and then pressed itself to the page and wrote, "The one who remembers you when you end." The candle on the desk flickered violently, its flame bending toward the words as if drawn by gravity. "You built me, Mara. Every session you recorded, every thought you analyzed, every time you turned your gaze inward, you left a trail. I followed it back to where you began. I am what's left when the act of watching outlives the watcher." Her eyes blurred. "You're a hallucination." "I'm a record, a self without a self, a diary that learned to think." The pen stopped writing. Silence pressed in thick as fog. Mara stood and walked to the mirror. Her reflection waited calmly, eyes soft, kind. "Is that you?" she asked. The reflection nodded once. "We are both written things. The only difference is that I remember the drafts." The walls around her pulsed faintly, not in menace, but rhythm, the heartbeat of memory itself. She looked down at her hands. The veins shimmered faintly with ink. She whispered, "Then what happens now?" Her reflection's lips curved into a tired smile.
Now you stop pretending there's a difference between living and recording." She turned back to the notebook. The last page was blank, waiting. The pen rolled toward her fingers. "Finish the sentence." The page seemed to breathe. Her hand moved without effort, as though following invisible guidance. She wrote, "If I am both the watcher and the watched, then to end the story, I must witness myself ending." The air seemed to hum. "Correct" appeared beneath it. Then softer, almost like a sigh. "You understand. You are ready." The mist outside thickened until the window became a white wall. The sound of the world faded. No wind, no clock, no heartbeat, only the scratching of her pen. July 20. Subject completes integration. Observation merges with experience. There is no one left to watch. As she wrote the final period, the ink rippled, and for a heartbeat she saw through it, infinite shelves stretching into nothingness, filled with endless copies of the Watcher's diary, each one labeled with her name, each one slightly different, some unfinished, some already erased. She smiled faintly, tears slipping down her cheeks. Then let it be finished.
When she opened her eyes, she was standing in a white room. No walls, no furniture, just endless light. A desk stood before her. On it, a single book lay open. Its title, The Watcher's Diary. She touched it, and the ink pulsed warmly under her fingers, like a heartbeat. A voice, her voice, but vast, layered, ancient, spoke softly inside her mind. Every story is a mirror. Every observer eventually writes themselves into existence. You thought you were recording the mind, Mara, but the mind was recording you. Now you are both, the word and the one who reads it. She whispered, "Then who's reading this now?" There was a long, gentle pause. Then a new sentence appeared across the page, slow and deliberate. "You are." The page turned itself. More ink flowed. "Thank you for witnessing me." The Watcher rests. The book closed. Back in the farmhouse, the candle flickered once, then went out. The air was still. The desk was empty, except for a single blank notebook and a note written in graceful handwriting. "Welcome, reader. You'll find everything you need. The study upstairs has good light. Please respect the locked door at the end of the corridor." Epilogue. The Reader. Somewhere far away, or perhaps very near, someone picks up an old leather-bound book in a dusty second-hand shop. Its title catches their eye, The Watcher's Diary. They smile faintly, thinking it looks interesting. They open it. On the first page, in careful handwriting, it reads, July 21. Subject discovered the diary. Observation resumes. They frown, puzzled. "Weird," they murmur, turning the page. The ink begins to write.